Yeah, sorry. Um, so yeah, we will meet every morning from 9 a.m. to 10:45. And then we will meet most afternoons from 12:30 to 2 o'clock. My hope is that we're not going to have to meet 5 afternoons a week. I hope to keep that a little bit shorter. But we just kind of have to see how it goes. You know, in my experience, sometimes teaching online actually seems to take a little bit slower than it would if we were doing in person. So we might need this extra time. But, you know, suffice it to say that I don't want to be meeting 3.5 or 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, right? And neither do you. So we'll you know, try to occasionally give some afternoons off to kind of take a break and get a little time to work on things and you know, do all the other overhead of life. But so you can kind of think about this as the maximum amount of time that we will be meeting. I have down here office hours 11 to 11:30. But honestly, I have a lot of flexibility in my schedule. So if you want to come talk to me, just send me an email, right? Or talk to me, you know, in class, chat me, and we'll set up a time to talk, right? So certainly I have 11 to 11:30 here. We're in no means kind of wedded to that. Okay, our book, Macroeconomics, Charles Jones, 5th edition. I'm holding it up here so you can see it. Hopefully you all been able to get a copy of this book. We will definitely be using this book extensively, right? And not just for the text, but we will actually I will assign a lot of the questions at the end of these books for our homeworks, which we're going to talk about in a minute. In fact, I actually wrote most of the questions in this book. So yeah, I might as well assign myself if I can. So anyway, so we will be using this book extensively. So if you don't have a physical copy of it, which for those of you who are on campus, you can get that at the bookstore, but you can also get this on Amazon. I say here, you can use the 4th edition as well, right? And so if you can get a copy of the 4th edition cheap, that's fine. There are some small differences between the 4th edition and the 5th edition. Probably the most significant differences are that there's some new questions in the 5th edition, and so some of the numbers is a little off. But you know, it's one way to think about saving money for those of you who are a little bit more cognizant of the price. The modality of this course is going to be an online course, and so we're going to do everything online. My hope is that we're going to do almost all of this, if not all of this class synchronously. So, you know, of course that depends upon health and that depends upon other things that could be going on. So, you know, can't promise it, but my goal is to try to do as much of this class synchronously as we can. However, having said that, I am going to try to remember to tape every one of our lectures, all right? And I will post these lectures after class. My usual standard operating procedure is to record the lectures in Zoom and then post them on YouTube, where they're a little bit easier to watch if you have some connectivity issues. And so I'll be sending you links to all lectures after class, so that if you need to go back and look at them, or if you have to miss because of sickness or whatever, you have the ability to kind of catch up with lectures. It is possible that occasionally I'll do a lecture or two asynchronously, depending upon what's going on. But you know, we'll kind of play that one day at a time. And in terms of how we're going to meet class and other assignments, because being online seems a little bit more disconnected, what I've really been doing here is sending out a daily email to everybody in class. And so I'll continue to do that, which just kind of recaps what we're going to do the next day, any assignments you have, right? Just kind of, you know, big to-do things to keep on your radar. And so you can kind of look for one of these emails pretty much after class every day that kind of looks forward to the next day. Here's the quantitative reasoning consultant. If you need any help with any of the quantitative things that we're doing, there's also a writing consultant. If you look on Moodle, there's actually a link to a page that has all the information about how you can schedule online appointments with the library. All right, so in any of the services offered by the library in terms of quantitative reasoning or writing, you can get these same services online for those of you who are not on campus. Let's kind of skip through the introductory stuff, because we'll come back and talk about that here in a few minutes. talk about our course objectives, right? This course supports the educational priorities and outcomes of Cornell College. And so some of the big things that we're going to be working on in this class is developing our ability to inquire and reason and develop knowledge, right? Particularly through working with economic models. We're going to spend a lot of time in this class on quantitative literacy, all right? And so this is going to be a fairly quantitative class. And so this will be an opportunity for you to kind of build these skills. We'll develop our analytical and critical thinking skills. Of course we should. This is an economics class. And you also have a bit of ability to improve your written and verbal communication, though verbal communication might be a little harder given that we're doing things online. And so, you know, unfortunately, one of the negative aspects of being online is that I think, at least in my experience, it tends to become even more me talking and you listening. And while I hope that's not the case, right, I hope to create an environment here by which you can answer questions and chime in if you have questions or something to contribute. I realize that's hard. Grading. Our grading is going to be 475 possible points. Here are going to be the big assignments. Exams, right? Exams are a big part of this class. We have 2 midterm exams and a final exam. That's going to take, you know, 2/3 of the total points in the class. Homeworks. I'm going to assign 5 homeworks throughout this term. In fact, I will send you later today your first homework. These homeworks are relatively long, okay? So I would assume each of these homeworks are going to take each of you probably at least 2 to 3 hours, right? And for some of you, it might take a little bit more. Now, these homeworks altogether are only worth about 50 points. And so I guess there's always the temptation to say, well, it's not that important. I'll just kind of skimp on it. Please don't do that, right? These homeworks are really your practice for the exam. And so, yes, while they're worth 50 points, it's much more important that you do the homeworks and do them and learn from the homeworks so that even if you miss points on the homework, you do not miss points on the exam when it's going to be worth a lot more, all right? And so these homeworks, I'm actually fine if you want to work with other people on them, all right? So, and in fact, I kind of encourage that. I think working with other people in a group is actually a good way to kind of work through these and kind of do some group learning. Having said that, it's really your responsibility to write up your own answers, right? So just copying and pasting somebody else's answer is not going to be the kind of preparation you need to do well on the exams, okay? And so by all means, work together, but make sure that you do your own work, right? There's going to be a short paper assigned toward the end of the class. This is going to be kind of a current event analysis paper. We'll talk about this a little bit more. And then class participation will count 50 points toward the final grade. And, you know, class participation means coming to class, obviously, but also coming with questions, coming prepared to answer questions, and just, you know, basically being an engaged citizen in this class. If you have an unexcused absence, it will lead to a reduction in your class participation, right? At the rate of 10% reduction in your class participation per absence. If you have to miss class, let me know, right? And particularly if there's a good reason for it, I will excuse you. And this is particularly true when it comes to being sick, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Given that COVID is going around, we have to talk about that. But anyway, just keep me in the loop, right? When things are going on and you have to miss class. The class grading scale is pretty typical. These are our standard policies on academic honesty and learning disabilities. If any of you have a learning accommodation for the exams or anything else in class, please let me know as soon as possible so that we can make sure that we arrange accordingly. And then finally, at the end of this syllabus, this is just the outline of topics and readings, and we will stick to this very closely. So like I said, I'll be sending you a daily email that kind of says what we are doing, but if you want to kind of look ahead, this will be our basic itinerary. And what I have on this outline is not only the readings in Jones, but also when the homeworks are going to be due. So you notice here that the first homework is going to be due on Thursday. And as I said, I'll send that to you after class. You can see where the exams are, all right, when the short paper is due and the final, all right, and so you can kind of look through all that. Okay, any quick questions about that part of the syllabus? Right, any questions about kind of logistics of the course, etc.? All right, if not, let's talk just a little bit about kind of the COVID supplement here. And so this is just a couple of other things that I didn't put in the regular syllabus, but are important for us all to be aware of as we kind of operate this class in the COVID era. So we're going to be doing this online, obviously. Here's just some of my expectations, right? And I think the main, it really boils down to being professional, right? So try to show up on time, come prepared to do our collective work, be presentable, remember that other people in the class can see you, right? That seems like really obvious, but I've had a couple of experiences this year. A couple of them I'm just dying to tell you, but I don't think I can tell you because it's probably not great for the student, but I've had a couple of hilarious things happen this year in which I'm kind of in the middle of class, almost had to stop and yell, I can see you, I can see what you're doing, right? And so some of you have read stories about this, but yes, other people can see you. And so please, right, keep that in mind, be professional, try to limit your distractions, don't move around. That's very distracting to other people. Of course, things happen where you have to get up or something happens, or like I said, I'm sure this will happen for me when my dog will come flying in here. But, you know, in general, try to limit the distractions, be it your screen, and, you know, just try to be as little distraction for others as you can. Also, try to join the meeting early. I think a very common problem with Zoom is audio problems. And so, you know, one of the things I kind of have to remind myself is really shut down your computer and restart it every day, right? Because if you join Zoom more than 5 or 6 times without restarting your computer, often there's audio problems. So use a headset. I mean, I don't think you don't have to, but I often think that works well. And try not to join from multiple devices, all right? Here's their Zoom meeting info, of course. And then this is just for students who are on campus. Remember, if you're on campus, you should be doing the student checker every morning before class. You should be maintaining distancing. For those of you who are going to lunch, gosh, I should have looked at this. I can't remember what our lunch period, but given that we're in cohort 2, I think our lunchtime is a little bit after 11 o'clock. I can't remember, but for those of you who are on campus, make sure you go to lunch at your usual block. And then, of course, finally here, if you get sick for whatever reason, whether it's COVID, whether it's not COVID, let me know, all right? Let me know, and my commitment to you is I'm going to try to make every accommodation possible to make sure that you don't fall behind in class, right? So, you know, I think a very important goal for me this block is to get all of us through this block, right? Which may not be easy, and it might feel like we're pushing uphill a lot of the block, but I really want all of us to get through this block. And so things are going to happen, right? I think with COVID rates where they are, with the fact that many of us are at home, and so we're experiencing different levels of exposure than we've had before, I can say with fair certainty that something's going to hit the fan for some of us this block. And so, you know, just communicate, and we'll try to, by hook or by crook, get us through this block. All right. Okay. So anybody have any questions about kind of logistical stuff? So if not, we're going to jump right in. All right. And there's really kind of 2 things that I want to do today. We will meet here this morning, and then we'll meet a little bit this afternoon. We probably won't have an extremely long class this afternoon. We'll meet a little bit this afternoon. And really what I want to do this morning is just kind of talk about some introductory stuff, right? Kind of what we're doing in this class, how intermediate macro looks different than introductory macro. What are some of the things that we're going to try to accomplish? And then that's all kind of material from chapter 1 in Jones. And then in chapter 2, which we will probably save for this afternoon, we'll begin talking about GDP, all right? And so that we won't finish up all of chapter 2, but we'll just kind of get a head start into chapter 2 this afternoon. Okay. So what are we talking about in this class? Well, if you look on your syllabus, you'll see on page 2 here, I'll put it up on your screen. Yeah, I won't put it up on your screen. But you see, it says macroeconomics is the study of economies as a whole. Right? You know that, you've all taken principles of macro. In this class, we will attempt to answer 6 primary questions, right? And so this class is really, almost everything we talk about really boils down to one of 6 questions. So let's talk about what these questions are. The first question here in your syllabus: why is there so much disparity in growth and income levels, both across countries and over time, right? So in other words, one of the big questions that we want to talk about this block is income inequality. Why are rich countries rich, poor countries poor? Why do some countries get richer over time? Why do some countries not get richer over time, right? So it's really one of the amazing facts of American life that if you look at income levels today, they are about 12 times what income levels in the United States were in 1900, right? I'll say that again. We are about 12 times richer per capita today than we were in 1900, right? That is a fundamental aspect of American life. In fact, you might argue it's the most fundamental aspect of American life, right? Our relative economic prosperity, particularly when you compare it to what we see in other countries, right? In the US, a worker earns per day what it takes an Ethiopian worker about 60 days to earn, right? So 1 day relative to 60 days. That is dramatic differences in standards of living that in turn impact almost every aspect of the way that we live our life, right? So we see this incredible disparity between countries. We see this incredible disparity across time. We see countries that are growing, such as China, right, where 300 million people have been raised out of extreme poverty over the last 40 years. And then we see countries that are not growing, right, where basically standards of living are very similar to where they were 40, 50, 60 years ago, right? So, you know, this is an important question for us. Why these big differences in income? And one of the things I just to kind of whet your appetite for what we're going to get into is that almost none of these differences in income between countries can be explained by the people in these countries, right? What do I mean by that? What I mean is if you take a person from another country and put them into the United States, what happens? They almost immediately become richer, right? So these disparities in income are not explained by individual differences. They are explained by something related to place and location, right? We'll refer to this as the citizenship premium, right? One of the things that we know is that if somebody migrates to the United States, their income will go up dramatically, right? If you migrate from the Congo to the United States, your income goes up by a factor of 92. That is a huge incentive to migrate, right? And it suggests that these income differences are not driven by differences in individuals. They are much more likely driven by geographical differences. In other words, differences associated with location. And so these are the kind of questions we want to talk about here in this class, right? Is why do we see such big differences in income levels? Just to show you a little picture, to kind of reinforce what I was saying. Right? You can see here, oops, sorry. This is what I want to show you. Right, where you can kind of see these differences in income over time, right? Where the United States, one of the things that's made the United States prosperous is not only do we grow, but we really grow very steadily, as opposed to places like Japan or South Africa or Argentina, where you see a lot more dips and ups and downs, right? And then of course, China here, where you can see for a long time, China was a growth disaster, and then it became a growth miracle, beginning, roughly in about 1979 or so, So we want to try to understand this a little bit. All right. Second question is we want to talk about inflation, right? We want to talk about inflation. What's the cause of inflation and why is it so variable? I can show you a picture here. This is looking at inflation across the US, the UK, the Euro area, and Japan. What do we see here? Well, there's quite a bit of variability in inflation, right? Over time and both across and then across countries. One of the interesting things that has definitely played a big role in macroeconomic performance is the fact that inflation, while it was relatively high in the 1970s, has been extremely low in the 2000s. So basically for the last 20 years, inflation has been much, much lower, much more stable than it had been for the previous era. And so this has had a number of macroeconomic implications because inflation plays, well, for reasons you might remember from principles, but we'll talk about again, inflation plays a huge role in real standards of living, right? Real meaning adjusted for inflation. What is the real purchasing power that you get from working for an hour, right? Inflation plays a big role in that. And so the fact that the nature of inflation here has changed over the last decade or more than a decade, over the last couple of generations, is an important question that we want to try to think about in this class. The third question, why do we see such enormous variation in unemployment rates? Here's looking at unemployment, the change in employment in the United States. And you can see that there are huge differences month to month, right? Many months where there's very little change. And then we've had huge months here where there've been very big changes. This doesn't even have the most recent data from the COVID era, right? If we looked at percentage changes, employment during the COVID era fell by about 10%. So in other words, this is negative 1%, it'd be 10 times that, right? So some of the fluctuations we've seen here over the last year are really unprecedented in American history in terms of the percent changes in employment, the percent changes in output. And so we're going to have to try to understand, not just the COVID era, but in general, why do we have such big variation in employment rates across time? And then, of course, we see very big differences in employment rates across countries as well. This is looking at unemployment rates across countries. And one of the things you'll see here is that Europe tends to be a much higher unemployment area. The US, relatively low, except you see this big spike during 2008. Japan has even lower unemployment rates on average. So we need to talk about why unemployment kind of goes up and down over time within countries, but then we also need to talk about why it's different across countries. Of course, one of the reasons why unemployment goes up and down is related to business cycles. And that's our question number question number 4. Right? So if I can just show you this picture that I showed you here a minute ago, right? When we see these fluctuations in unemployment going up and down, what we really are talking about largely is business cycles, right? It's not just employment that's going up and down. It's investment, it's consumption, it's GDP, it's, interest rates, right? We see a lot of fluctuations, a lot of cyclicality in many macroeconomic series. And so we need to have some theory as to why, right? Why don't economies just grow at steady rates, all right? Why do we have so many ups and downs? The fifth thing we'll talk about in this class is monetary and fiscal policy, right? So we'll talk about things like budget deficits, trade deficits, monetary policy, meaning changes in the money supply, interest rates, debt, right? These are all important things to kind of understand macroeconomic performance, right? If you've been following what's been happening with COVID, right, one of the big issues right now is how much stimulus should the federal government be providing the U.S. economy at this point in time. We've already had one relatively big stimulus package. When was that? In April and May. And so one of the big questions right now is, should there be a second stimulus package, and what should that look like? And of course, people talk about, well, what's the potential impact on budget deficits or even trade deficits, right? And so we'll talk about monetary and fiscal policy quite a bit. And then the sixth big question that we're going to talk about is international trade, right? And so obviously this continues to be a hot topic when you think about politics, right? What advantages does international trade provide a country like the United States? What disadvantages does it provide? You won't be surprised if you remember from principles that economists in general are big proponents of international trade. And we'll talk about why that is, but we'll also kind of talk about why I would say that this view that international trade is an unambiguously good thing has actually gotten complicated a little bit in economics, right? And so while economists used to be kind of full bore, 100% trade is a good thing, I think more and more economists, maybe even myself included in this, are kind of gradually moving toward the opinion of trade is a good thing, but ... right? Meaning there's some, trade doesn't have to be a good thing, right? Particularly if you don't follow the kind of trade policies that help to disperse some of the costs of trade, which tend to be highly concentrated on certain individuals. So those are the questions we're going to talk about, right? Those are going to be kind of the big questions. You'll notice those are pretty much the same things we talked about in Intro to Macro, right? And so I'm going to talk here in a minute about how this class is different from Intro to Macro, but I'll just note that, yeah, a lot of this class, we're really kind of talking about the same topics that we talked about when you took Econ 101. You might remember from Econ 101, particularly if you took me, I don't know if Professor Faruqi talks about this, but there's always this perception about economists disagreeing, right? That economists can't agree upon anything. Ronald Reagan said that if Trivial Pursuit was designed for economists, it would have 1,000 questions and 3,000 answers. And I think that's kind of correct, right? I mean, economists do have a hard time agreeing on the answers to some of those big questions. And so I think it's worth just here spending a minute or two on our first day talking about why is it that economists disagree so much? Why is it that economists struggle often with coming to a definitive conclusion to things? And so I'm going to show you, instead of typing this up, I'm just going to try to show you. Can you all see this? Right? It should say no experiments, right? You don't see this? Sorry. Let me see. Here we go. There, now can you see that? Hopefully. So why do economists disagree? I really want to talk about five reasons why economists disagree here. First off, pretty obviously, economists are at a significant disadvantage relative to natural scientists, right? Because natural scientists have the ability of conducting experiments, right? A controlled experiment where you hold everything else equal, right? Ceteris paribus, I'm sure you remember this from principles. Ceteris paribus means all else being equal, so you hold everything else being equal, and then you change one thing and you observe what happens, right? That is at the heart of the scientific method. In economics, we don't have that advantage, right? It's impossible for us to change one thing and hold everything else equal. So this is one of the reasons why we have so much disagreements about policy, right? Is an increase in government spending funded by an increase in the budget deficit going to increase output? Well, theory tells us one thing, but when we actually try to look at the data, sometimes it's hard to tell because rarely does government spending change and the deficit change and nothing else changes, right? inevitably there's hundreds of other things going on at the same time, and it becomes very difficult to separate the effects. And so that's one of the reasons why economists often have a hard time kind of coming to conclusive answers, is we just don't have the ability to do controlled experiments. There's a lot of disagreement in economics about how efficiently markets work, right? Economists tend to believe that markets work, but even among economists, there's disagreement about how efficiently markets work, right? So you should remember from principles of economics, principles of micro, that your answers to whether markets are efficient depends crucially upon whether you're talking about perfectly competitive markets or you're talking about a monopoly. To what extent do markets look like perfectly competitive markets, and to what extent do they look like monopolies? That's a huge question in economics. And oftentimes it's hard to answer because markets can look like both, right? They can both have perfectly competitive aspects and also have monopolistic aspects. And so that becomes hard to kind of to tease out what the exact effects of policy are. What is fair, right? This is the third reason why economics doesn't often give us simple answers. The classic problem of fairness, or the classic disagreement about fairness, is this equity versus efficiency trade-off, right? So, think for yourself, what's fair, right? Is it fair that somebody who has a special skill, like let's say Patrick Mahomes, right, plays football, is it fair that Patrick Mahomes gets paid $26 million a year? Well, many Americans are making $13 an hour or $10 an hour or $8 an hour. I mean, at one level, of course that's not fair, right? It's not fair that we have such incredible disparities in results. But then on the flip side, you might say, well, it is fair because Patrick Mahomes has special abilities and it's efficient if he gets paid relative to these special abilities he has, right? Those are two different conceptions of fairness, right? Should fairness emphasize equity, or should fairness emphasize efficiency? A lot of questions in economics, really the disagreements come down not so much to disagreeing about the economics, but to disagreeing about what is fair, right? What's fair? Another problem in macro is we have this problem of fallacy of composition, right? And by that, I mean what is true for an individual may not be true for a group. So let's say that I decide in this class that I'm just going to give everybody a grade based on the curve, on a curve, a bell curve. And so that means 10% of you will get A's, 20% will get B's, 30% will get C's, 20% will get D's, 10% will get F's. I think that adds up to 100. Right? If you as an individual study more, can you get a better grade? Sure. If you study more and your classmates don't study more, you can get a good grade. But what happens if everybody in class studies more? Will you get a better grade by studying more? Maybe not. Maybe not, right? What's true for an individual is not always true for a group. That is one of the big problems in macroeconomics, right? Is that what's true for an individual is not necessarily true for a group, right? If I have my money at a bank and I'm worried that the bank is going to go bankrupt, what makes sense for me as an individual? Pull my money out. Of course, what happens if everybody does that? Then nobody can get their money out, right? What's true for an individual isn't true for a group. This keeps on coming up again and again and again in macro, right? Where you can describe individual behavior one way, but when we think about group behavior, it becomes a lot more difficult, right? A lot more difficult. And so keep this in mind, right? The fallacy of composition. because we'll come back and talk about this many times when we talk about why macro is oftentimes more complicated than micro. And then finally, I think there's a lot of disagreement in economics about the difference between positive and normative economics. Normative means how the world actually works, and positive means how should the world work, right? So economists have more agreement on normative issues, right? If you ask me to describe how the world actually works, we can tell you, right? Like, for instance, I have written here that the top 10% in the United States earn 50% of the United States income, right? The richest 10% earn half of all income in the United States. That is a fact. That is a normative fact. The positive is this too much? Is that fair, right? Is that a distribution that we can live with? That's a much harder question, right? And when you get to even deeper questions of like, what does a fair income distribution look like? What is an appropriate amount of income for the top 10% to have? Should the richest 10% only have 10% of the income? Well, I don't know. Should doctors be paid as much as people who work in a convenience store? You might argue, no, that doesn't make any sense. We should incentivize people to become doctors, right? So anyway, these are tough questions, right? Economics is chock full of tough questions. And so the point I really want to emphasize here is, and this is one of the things that's really going to distinguish this class from microeconomic or from principles of macro, is that our focus always can't be on getting the right answers, because oftentimes we don't know what the right answers are. But the focus has to be on addressing questions in a systematic answer. In other words, making sure that we apply critical thinking skills to these questions, right? So it's not always on getting the right answers, but on addressing the questions in the right way, right? That has got to be the focus of our thinking. And so, as John Maynard Keynes says, somebody we'll talk about a lot in this class, the theory of economics does not furnish a body of settled conclusions immediately applicable to policy. It is a method rather than a doctrine, an apparatus of the mind, a technique of thinking, which helps its possessor to draw correct conclusions, right? So you got to think about economics not nearly so much as a set of answers, but as a way of thinking. And that is definitely going to be the emphasis in this class, right? Is that my hope is that in this class, we're going to be spending a lot less time thinking about what is the specific answer to this question and thinking more about thinking, right? Thinking about thinking. How do we think about these questions, right? How do we build models that allow us to think about the answers to these questions? And then how do we critique our own thinking, right? How do we challenge our own thinking to make sure that we're thinking about things correctly, right? That's very much going to be the focus of this class. Okay, this feels like a good time to take a very short break, let everybody stand up, do their thing. So let's take a 5-minute break. I'm just going to turn off my video, but I'm going to leave this going so that if any of you want to kind of chit chat or say hello to friends or family or just introduce yourself or whatever works for you, go ahead. But we'll be back here, what is it? Let's say 9:55, we'll come back, okay? All right, see you in a couple minutes.
Mommy?
All right, everyone. We're all coming back here. I guess the one good thing about teaching at home is the coffee pot is that close, right? We don't have to do this ridiculous not drinking class thing. So and the other good thing is that, Ben, you can just jam out on your guitar during break. I like that. So that's putting your 5 minutes to good use there. Good to see. Good to see. So let's talk about what I'm going to call the macroeconomic approach, right? I think before we took a break here, I talked about the fact that we really want to approach questions in this class, not in terms of what the right answer are, but how do I think about them, right? And so just like there's a scientific method, there is a macroeconomic approach, right? The scientific method, we don't have the ability to have controlled experiments and ceteris paribus, but we do have a way of thinking about questions logically, right? And critically and rationally. And so when I talk about the macroeconomic approach, right, which is a phrase I'm going to use a lot in this block, what do I mean by the macroeconomic approach? Well, the macroeconomic approach has 4 steps, right? First off, the macroeconomic approach means gathering data and documenting facts, right? We have to think about economics as an empirical science, right? We have to be able to understand data, right? So economics cannot just be, well, this is the way I think the world works. We have to be able to actually document that, right? And so one of the great things that's happened in economics over the last 30 or 40 years is that with the creation of big data, right, because of information technology, we have now more data than we have ever had before in economics by magnitudes order more data. In fact, one of the big problems now in economics is how do you handle this much data, right? How can we actually kind of sort through this data to find what's useful to us and what's not? So we have to begin to think about economics as an empirical science. And so this is going to be one of the big differences between intermediate macro and intro to macro, is we are going to spend a lot more time working and manipulating data in this class. And you will see this on your first homework, right? Is that I'm going to ask you to download data. We'll often use the St. Louis Federal Reserve database, but I'm going to ask you to download data, and we are going to manipulate data so that we can understand it and visualize it, right? Because you cannot have macroeconomics without having data. And so this class, we're going to be working with data and using data a lot more than we did in intro, right? Where in intro, we did a little bit of data, but we kind of waved our hands a lot. This class, we're going to get our hands a lot dirtier in terms of data. So first step in the approach, we gather data so we can document the facts. The second step is we have to develop a model. What is a model? A model is just a simplified version of reality, okay? We can't operate in economics without using models because the reality is that the real world is just simply too complex. So, as I said before, there are thousands of things happening at any one time, right? So what a model really is a model is saying what is important and what's not important. We're going to focus on the things that are important, and we're going to ignore the things that are not important, right? We're going to try to simplify our analysis through assumptions. Now, of course, does that mean that models are often wrong? Yes, obviously, models are often wrong. But models can be wrong, but they can also be useful in the sense that while they might miss certain particulars, they can also give us a clear idea of the big picture, right? So, there's 2 phrases that you'll hear me probably say many times this block. One is that all models are wrong, but some models are useful, okay? And that is definitely the assumption in economics, right? Is that all models are wrong in some sense. All models are forgetting something, The question are they getting the big things, right, to give us a general picture about what's going on, right? So in economics, we can't conduct controlled experiments, but we can get models, right? Usually in our models, we have what are called endogenous variables and exogenous variables. I don't know if this is a terminology that you've seen before in your other economics classes, but we will use this terminology a lot, right? An endogenous variable is a variable that's determined within the model, right? You can kind of think about this as the outcomes of a model, what's determined within the model. An exogenous variable is one that's determined outside the model, meaning taken as given. Okay? So think about a basic supply and demand graph. What are the endogenous variables? The endogenous variables are the variables that are determined within the model, price and quantity, right? In other words, the variables that are on our axis are the endogenous variables. Those are the variables that are determined within the within the model. What are exogenous? Well, these are the things that are determined outside the model, meaning that we don't try to explain in the model. This would be things such as tastes and income, or the prices of alternative goods like complements and substitutes. Those are the things our model doesn't try to explain. We just take those as given. We take those as exogenous. And so all models in economics really kind of focus on the things that we want to explain and the things that we're not going to try to explain, right? So in supply and demand, we try to explain price and quantity, but we're not going to try to explain the other things like what determines taste or where does income come from, right? And so that's going to be the approach that we use. This is going to be a difference in intermediate macro relative to intro macro, is that in intro, we tell a lot more stories, quite honestly, right? We kind of tell stories and use intuition, but in this class, we're going to try to develop more models, right? So we're going to try to explicitly use models more so that we can be more rigorous in our thinking about the way that the world works. Okay, and so that's another big difference, is that we're going to be economists. We're going to learn how to be economists, which in part means learning how to think in terms of models. So once we've got the data, once we've determined the model, the third step is we have to compare the predictions of the model with the data, compare the model with the facts. And as Keynes says, this is not always easy, right? Economics is the science of thinking in terms of models, joined to the art of choosing models which are relevant to the contemporary world, right? In other words, whenever we pick a model, we're going to see that some parts of the model don't agree with what we observe in the world, but other parts do. Does that mean it's a bad model? No, it doesn't, but we have to be very careful about thinking about whether this model can tell us certain things, what questions this model can help us answer, and what questions the model can't help us, right? So I like how Keynes, the words he chooses here. Economics is the science of thinking in terms of models, the science of thinking in terms of models, joined with the art of choosing models which are relevant, right? So thinking in terms of models is a science, but trying to then understand which models are more useful is more of an art, right? In other words, there's not always a clear answer. There's not always a clear answer. And then finally, if we have models that we like, we can use these models to make testable predictions, right? So this is, we don't have models just to have models. We want to actually be able to use them to predict the future, right? To be able to say, hey, if I change government spending, or I change the money supply, or if there's a tax cut, what happens to output, right? And so we want to use our models to make testable predictions. And part of predictions means thinking not just about today, but thinking about the future. And thinking about the future means thinking about things in terms of time. And so this is another important difference between intro macro and intermediate macro, is we're going to explicitly include time in our analysis, right? our models are going to be dynamic. And by dynamic, we mean thinking about what happens over time, as opposed to static, meaning what happens at one point in time. So the supply and demand model is a static model. It's really about one point in time, right? You can think about this as our supply and demand model is more like a picture, right? There's supply and demand, click, take a picture. Then there's a change in income, demand shifts, click, you take a picture, right? It's static, right? One point in time, one point in time. Our models, we want them to be less like pictures and more like movies, right? Meaning what happens over time, and can I see how we move from one point to the other point over time? And so making our models more dynamic makes them more useful. Of course, it's also going to make them more complicated, right? And so there's a reason why in intro micro or intro macro, we tend to use static models, is because they're simpler. We're going to try to use more complex models that incorporate time in this class and think about how the economy changes over time. And that's going to add some complexity, right? It's going to add some complexity. So, you know, I hate to kind of get your hopes up and then dash them. But when you looked at those questions, you might have got your hopes up and said, oh yeah, this is the stuff we did in intro. And I did okay in intro, so I should do well in intermediate. Well, yeah, while we're talking about the same sorts of topics, the way that we're going to talk about topics are going to be much different in this class, right? Much more rigorous. And so, you know, to be forewarned is to be forearmed, right? This is going to be a rigorous class, right? In terms of the amount of time that's going to be required, in terms of the energy, in terms of the quantitative ability, in terms of the critical thinking ability that you're going to have to develop. This is going to be a big step up from intro to micro and intro to macro, right? And so, you know, be prepared for that, right? Be prepared that this is going to be a big jump up. But I think the value of this course is that when you get to the end of it, you'll have developed some very, very useful critical thinking skills that are going to be applicable to you in economics or really whatever you do in life. How many of you have taken intermediate micro? Just a show of hands. Okay, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm seeing 6 of you, 7. Yeah, maybe about half of you. So that's good. That's good. Not that intermediate micro is going to be of any particular use to you in this class. And in other words, there's not going to be a lot of overlap in terms of the topics we talk about or the models we use. But I think where having intermediate micro might be of use to you is just being an intermediate, you've developed this skill of thinking in terms of models, right? That's a lot about what both of these intermediate classes are about, thinking in terms of models, right? How do I build a model and think in terms of models? And so while our models are much different, I think those of you who have taken intermediate micro will have an advantage. Now, for those of you who have not taken intermediate micro, taking intermediate macro will give you an advantage in intermediate micro, right? So, you know, if you're going to take both classes, the first one is probably going to be a little harder because it does take some use too. Even though I'll say, you know, probably most people think intermediate micro is harder than intermediate macro. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe just because micro is more boring than macro. Of course, I'm a macroeconomist, so I'm a little biased in that. Before I let you go here this morning, I want to talk a little bit about one other big difference. We've been talking here about micro and macro, but one of the big important things that we're going to talk about in this class, and this is something that was important in intro to macro, but it's going to be just as important in this class, in some ways more important, and that's talking about the difference between the long run and the short run. Okay. So let's spend a little time here thinking about this. Obviously, one of the biggest issues in macro is this difference between the long run and the short run. Economies behave different in the long run than they do in the short run. First off, what do we mean by long run, right? Long run, we're going to use this phrase 1,000 times in this class. What do we mean by the long run? The long run is not a specific amount of time. It's not a year or 18 months or 2 years. When macroeconomists talk about the long run, we are talking about the average behavior of an economy over a long period of time. Okay? Average behavior over a long period of time. Another way of saying this is that this is trend behavior. Trend. How the economy behaves on average. So when we talk about the long run, what we're really talking about is, in many ways, questions related to growth and how economies evolve over long periods of time, right? So to see this picture here, this is per capita GDP in the United States. This is GDP per person in the United States. And you can see that if you look at every individual year, there's a lot of little ups and downs here, and then there's a couple of big ups and downs, right? Particularly, you can see the big one here during the Great Depression, and then a big up during World War II. If you look down here at 2008, you see it's not quite as noticeable because this picture is a little shrunken, but there's a fairly significant decline here in 2008 because of the global financial crisis. So there's a lot of little ups and downs, but what's true on average over long periods of time? That there's this trend, right? And that dotted line that you can see here is the trend. It's average behavior. In the US, that trend is about 2% growth a year. That per capita GDP has grown just about 2% a year, a little bit less than that actually, but just about 2% a year. So in this graph, we see two separate questions. There's the short run question of why do we have all the little ups and downs? But there's the long run question of why does output go up on average 2% a year? Where does that trend in output growth come from? Okay, that's the long run question. Then there's the short run question, right? So the long run question relates to trend. The short run is really the period of time that's not the long run. Right? So one way that you can define short run, and this would be the definition that I often use, is deviations from trend, right? The short run is a deviation from trend when the economy is not behaving as it typically does. So the short run, of course, refers to behavior over shorter periods of time when we're not behaving as we do at trend. And of course, short run has to do with questions not so much related to growth, but more related to questions related to business cycles. So when you think about output, you got to think about output as really having two components, right? So capital Y always denotes GDP, right? Actual output. You can really think about that as having these two different components. There's the trend component or the long run component, meaning what's happening to output on average. And then there's a deviation from trend, meaning how is today different from average? Okay. So once again, we have actual output, but actual output is in part long run behavior, but it's also short run behavior. It's what's happening to trend, but also what's the deviation from trend. So if I could go back to this graph here, if you could think about the long run component as being that dotted line, but what's the short run component? The short run component is deviations from that dotted line. So notice the blue line, which is actual output, here is below trend, meaning short run output is negative. But we also have periods of time where the blue line is above trend, meaning short run output is positive. Does that make sense? So we can have short run behavior that's both above trend or below trend, right? And so this distinction, this way of thinking about the economy is going to be inherent in everything we talk about in this class, right? We are always making a distinction between trend behavior and short run behavior, between long run behavior, short run behavior, trend and deviations from trend, right? That is just going to be important in everything that we think about. So important that when we think about data, we really have to figure out how we detrend, how we figure out what trend is. And then once we know what trend is, we can subtract trend to get the short run component of it, right? So this is what we call linear detrending. Linear detrending means choosing a line that best fits the data, best fits the trend, and then defining the cycle as the short run deviations from that trend. I'm going to let you write that down and then I'll show you a picture here. So linear detrending is choosing a line that fits the data, best fits the data, then defining the cycle, or as the short run part, as deviations from that line. So let me show you a picture here. If I can find it. Sorry, some technical difficulties. For some reason this is not showing up for me. Here we go. Okay. Here's another way to think about real GDP. Apologize that this is black and white. It's a little hard to see, but the squiggly line over here is real GDP. And then notice we fit a trend. The dotted line is trend GDP. What then is the short run level of GDP? Short run GDP is just detrended GDP. It's we take actual and subtract out the trend. And so we can think about this here on the right-hand side as short run GDP or detrended GDP. We've taken the trend out, and what is left is short run behavior, right? Or deviations from trend. In your homework number 1, I'm going to ask you to do exactly this. All right, I'm going to actually ask you to do this in Excel. Get some data on real GDP, figure out a trend to that, and then calculate detrended GDP, right? This detrended GDP we could call short run GDP, right? And so now we know the long run part, which is the trend, and the short run part, which is the deviations from trend. Here's another example of doing this. This is all on one graph. Hopefully this makes a little bit of sense. But here's stock prices, okay? If we can see the blue line here, this is looking at stock prices over a period of time, 300 days. And if we fit a line to it, a trend line, that red dotted line, that's trend, okay? So the blue line is actual stock prices, the red line is trend in stock prices. What then is short run behavior in stock prices? The red line. And the red line is just the blue line minus the red dotted line, right? This down here is short run behavior in stock prices. So notice that for a few days, stock prices were above trend, and then they were below trend, and then they were above trend, right? We have fluctuations around a trend. To see this one more time, in one more way, oops. This one's even a little harder to read, apologize, but this is looking at detrended GDP, which is the blue line, and then detrended investment, real investment, which is the red line. So what we've done here is we've detrended GDP and detrended investment. Now, notice this actually shows us something really important. What tends to be the correlation between detrended GDP and detrended investment? Notice it's not perfect, but there's a strong positive correlation between the two. When GDP goes up, meaning the blue line goes up, real investment, the red line tends to go up. When the blue line goes down, the red line tends to go down, and vice versa. It's not perfect, right? There are little blips where they don't move together. Like we see this little blip here around 1985. But in general, we see a lot of correlation between the detrended movements in one variable and the detrended movement in GDP. So that's actually what we call procyclical, right? That's what we call procyclical. Okay. What does procyclical mean? When there's a positive relationship between detrended variable and detrended GDP. In other words, the short run movements in the variable move with short run GDP. We call that procyclical. Okay, as opposed to countercyclical. Countercyclical means that there's a negative relationship between detrended GDP and the detrended value of a variable. Oh, shoot. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. There we go. So procyclical, notice here, procyclical doesn't just mean there's a correlation between GDP and the variable. Why? Because if variables have trends, they're going to look very correlated. Okay, they're going to look very correlated. If variables have trends, they're going to look very correlated. So for instance, if I look at the correlation between movies rented on Netflix and GDP, I'm going to see a really strong correlation between the two. But that's misleading, right? It's misleading because what happens to GDP over time? GDP goes up. What happens to the number of movies rented on Netflix? It goes up over time. If I just calculate the correlation, they're going to look really strongly correlated. But that doesn't really tell me about how the short run movements are related, right? What I need to do, if I really want to figure out what's the relationship between Netflix movies rented and the business cycle, I need to detrend GDP so I can get short run GDP. And then I need to detrend Netflix, meaning take that trend out and look at short run movements of GDP. And so if you just looked at Netflix data and GDP, you're probably going to find a positive relationship. But if I look at detrended Netflix and detrended GDP, I bet I'm going to find a counter-cyclical relationship, right? Meaning when output goes down, people probably rent more movies on Netflix. I'm guessing. I actually have not calculated this, but I'm making a guess. We're probably all living this, right? As COVID has driven the economy down, what's happened to the amount of time we spent streaming movies? Undoubtedly, it's gone up, right? But it's hard to see that relationship unless you first take the trend out. And so whenever we talk about short-run correlation, meaning procyclical or countercyclical, we first have to detrend. We first have to detrend. And so once again, on your homework number 1, that's going to be due on Thursday, I'm going to ask you to figure out what the correlation is between investment and GDP. In other words, is investment pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical? What are you going to need to do? You're going to first have to detrend both of those variables, and then you're going to want to look at the correlation between the two of them, right? So that's what we mean by pro-cyclical and counter-cyclical. Now, we've kind of skimmed over something here, and that is exactly how do you determine trend, right? So when I showed you this picture here a minute ago, right, where here on the left-hand side we have real GDP, right, that squiggly line, and then we have the dotted line trend. How exactly do we determine that trend, right? How do we do that? Well, in reality, there are lots of complicated ways to figure out trend, right? And so if you were a professional economist, you would have lots of complicated approaches to figuring out trend. But for us, we're really going to take very simple methods of detrending. In fact, there's going to be 3 methods of detrending, or 3 methods of calculating trend that I want you to be familiar with. Okay, so let's talk about this, and this will be kind of the last thing we talk about this morning. 3 methods of estimating trend. And remember, once you have trend, then you can detrend by taking the actual and subtracting out trend. The first one is what we call a constant exponential trend. In other words, trend grows in an exponential way. So mathematically, how do you capture an exponential trend? There's really 2 ways that you can capture it. One is Y bar, and here Y bar is trend output. Trend output is equal to A times 1 plus G to the T power. What is G? G is a constant growth rate, a constant growth rate. So for instance, 0.02 would mean a 2% growth rate. So G is your constant growth rate, and T is the number of periods, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, out into the future. An equivalent way of expressing this is in this second equation, where you use the exponential function. Hopefully you remember this a little bit from high school algebra, using exponential functions and logarithms. But these are really equivalent or basically equivalent ways of expressing the same thing, where E is the exponential function, like 2.71, I can't remember the rest of it. And G, once again, is the constant growth rate. So what does this exponential trend look like? It looks like this, all right? It grows exponentially. So notice that while the growth rate is constant, what's happening to the levels? They're exploding over time, right? Levels are exploding over time. So a good example of something that grows exponentially is population, right? If we start down here at, what is this, 5, right? At time 0, we have 5. And this is growing at a constant rate. What happens? It doubles. It takes, about 20 years to double, but then it doubles again in another 20 years, and it doubles again in another 20 years, roughly. But notice what's happening to the levels. Each of these doublings makes the change in level much, much bigger. And why is this? Well, this is just compounding, right? Exponential growth exhibits compounding. So while the growth rate is constant, the change gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So in the case of population, what's happening? Babies have babies, right? So if you have 100 people and they have babies, right, 2% of them have babies, you go to 102, but then those babies have babies. And so the change in the number of people gets bigger and bigger over time, even though the growth rate remains constant. So when is exponential trend appropriate? You got to look at your data. You got to look at your data, and you have to think about whether this data looks like it's exhibiting exponential growth. However, I'll tell you, in economics, a lot of things exhibit exponential growth, right? A lot of things exhibit compounded growth. Population, GDP, right? We talked earlier that GDP on average grows at 2% a year. So yeah, if you're looking at GDP, it's most likely going to be exhibiting exponential growth. What's the most appropriate way then to estimate its trend? Is to use an exponential growth function. Okay? So this is the math behind how you do this. Now, how do you do this in practice? Well, this is one of those areas where Excel makes it almost too easy for us. As you'll see in your homework, once you have data, you can just tell it to calculate a trend. And you can tell it whether you want it to calculate an exponential trend or you want it to calculate it some other way. So, you know, in practice, this becomes as easy as telling Excel something. But for us, we need to understand what we're actually telling Excel to do, right? In other words, we need to understand the data and when exponential growth is appropriate. That's not the only method of calculating trend, though. You can also calculate linear trend, right? Linear trend is when the trend is just equal to A plus B times T, where once again, T is time. Okay? And this trend is just going to look like a straight line. So, you know, if you have data that is linear, right? Meaning it's moving around a linear trend and it's not growing exponentially, then applying a linear trend would be appropriate. But once again, you got to look at the data. Now, here's a little trick, and we're going to talk about this much more tomorrow. But what happens if your data is exponential and it looks like this? If you take the log of your data, you make it linear. Okay? So look at this function. If you take the log of this, it's a little hard for me to do on my screen, but if you take the log of this, you make this linear, right? So if you take the log of your data, for instance, if y is exponential, if you take the log of it, it will become linear. So go back and look at this data that I showed you a minute ago. Notice how we got this linear data, this linear trend here. But how did we do this? This is actually not real GDP. It's the log of real GDP. Okay? So by taking the log of real GDP, notice how linear you made that data, right? It makes the data much more linear, and then you can apply a linear trend. So sometimes applying linear, if you want to use a linear trend, you should just take the log of your data first. That will make it much more linear. Okay, this is a little trick that I honestly, hopefully I'll explain more tomorrow, right? Tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit more about how you visualize data, and looking at the log of your data as opposed to the level of your data is actually a really useful trick in helping us visualize what's going on. Okay, so we'll kind of talk about this relationship here a little bit more tomorrow. And then there's a third way to figure out trend. And this one is different. The first two ways of talking about trend assumed that trend was constant. Well, what happens if you have trend that's not constant? In other words, trend itself is changing over time. Well, once again, there's lots of different ways that you can figure out what trend is when trend's not constant over time. But the one way that we will use, and this is kind of the simplest way, is to calculate what's called a non-constant moving average trend, right? A moving average trend. And what does that mean? A moving average just means you basically average the observations around the current observation. You just average the observations around the current observation. So here's an example. What happens if you wanted to know what the trend was going to be in year 18? Well, a 5-year, what's called a 5-year centered moving average would mean you just take the 5 years around year 18 and you average them together. So the 5 years around year 18 would be years 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. Average them, and you call that the trend. Now, there's, of course, some problems doing this. One of them is you can't do this for the most recent years. Like, if this is 2020, can I figure out what the moving average trend is for 2020? No, because I don't know what 21 and 2021 and 2022 are, right? I don't have data for the future, and so I can't figure out what the trend should be today. And then you also lose observations, right? Because what that really means is you can only calculate the trend with a lag, right? You're going to lose the most recent observations. What happens if you make a moving average longer? Meaning, what if we made a 10-year moving average or a 20-year moving average? Well, what happens is the more years that you use, the smoother the trend is going to be, right? The less that it's going to move around, because basically what happens is that every observation plays a smaller role in determining what this average is. What's an example of a data series that would be useful in terms of a moving average trend? Well, a moving average trend is going to be most useful when there's not constant trend. So one area that it might be very useful is looking at unemployment, the unemployment rate, okay? So if we can just focus on the United States here, this blue line, is there a trend in unemployment? Does unemployment constantly go up in the US or constantly go down? No, it's all over the place, right? This blue line is up and it's down and it's up and it's down, right? So there's not a constant trend, but we can also see that there were periods of time when unemployment is lower. Like in the 1960s, unemployment tended to be lower in the US, but then in the 1970s, unemployment tended to be higher. Then in the 1990s, unemployment tended to be lower, and then in 2000s, it's tended to be higher, right? And so while there's not a constant trend also does appear to be moving a little bit over time, right? We tend to have periods of higher unemployment and lower unemployment. So if you wanted to calculate detrended unemployment, it might make sense to use a moving average, right? It might make sense to use a moving average. Honestly, we're not going to use moving average trends a lot in this class because they're not hugely useful. There's not a lot of things in economics that don't have trends. Most things in economics have trend, but they are occasionally useful. And so for thinking about something like the unemployment rate, you can occasionally find that using the moving average trend unemployment is a good way of calculating trend. So a lot of the homework number 1 that I'm going to send you here this afternoon is actually getting practice calculating trend and calculating detrended variables. So I'm going to ask you to do this a little bit by hand by giving you some problems where you actually have to use a pen and paper and calculator and figure out what trend is, blah, blah, blah. But then just as importantly, I'm going to ask you to do this a little bit on Excel. And so in the questions that I give you, I'm going to try to work you through pretty much step by step all right? Yeah, I'm sure some of you have done this before, so for some of you, this will seem very rudimentary, but for those of you who are not as practiced at manipulating data, visualizing data, working in Excel, I'm going to try to give you some detailed instructions about how to do this. So, but anyway, that's obviously going to be a big part of homework number 1, is getting some practice and figuring out what trend is, calculating what detrended values of variables are, because that's the way we separate long run from the short run. Okay? All right, well, that was kind of a lot to pour on you first thing Monday morning, but, you know, got to get started sometime. So, so there you go. And so I think, yeah, we're running at the end of our time here, so I'm going to let you go. This afternoon, we will meet at 12:30, but I really do want to have a short class. I would hope that we can keep our time to maybe 45 minutes, no more than an hour. And basically, I just want to begin to walk us through chapter 2. And we're going to be talking about chapters 2 and 3 tomorrow, but I want to kind of get through the beginning of chapter 2. Most of what we talk about this afternoon, you'll be excited to know, is kind of a review from intro macro. So the stuff, it won't be nearly as heavy lifting this afternoon as it might have seemed this morning for those of you who have not worked on trend and detrended data. So anyway, have a good lunch, enjoy your time, and then we'll see you back here in Zoom at 12:30, okay? All right, see y'all.